Studies in the Gospel of John. Lesson 14. Jesus multiplies food and walks on water. Review and quizzing. In what chapter does the following occur? He said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? And he had to pass through Samaria. He saw the linen wrappings lying there. Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii? And he made a scourge of cords. Pause the video and find those passages. Review and quizzing. Answers. In what chapter does the following occur? He said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? That's 13, verse 6. And he had to pass through Samaria. That's chapter 4, verse 4. He saw the linen wrappings lying there. That's 20, verse 5. Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii? That's chapter 12, verse 5. And he made a scourge of cords. That's 2:15. More review and quizzing. In what chapter does the following occur? Keep them from the evil one. My Father is working until now. Go, wash in the pool of Siloam. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness. And my Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit. Pause the video and find those passages. Review and quizzing. Answers. In what chapter does the following occur? Keep them from the evil one. That's 17, verse 15. My Father is working until now. That's chapter 5, verse 17. Go, wash in the pool of Siloam. That's chapter 9, verse 7. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness. That's chapter 3, verse 14. And my Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit. That's 15, verse 8. Feeding the 5,000 is in all four Gospels. Aside from the resurrection, the multiplication of the loaves and fishes is the only miraculous sign recorded in all four Gospels. If we believe that God inspired and directed the writing of the New Testament, we're driven to pay special note to that which he felt was important enough to repeat for emphasis. As is often the case, the Apostle John gives us a different side of the story than the other writers. The bread of life discourse that follows, verses 22 to 71, is unique to this book and adds insight into the significance of this miracle. God's hand demonstrated. Both the multiplication of the food and the walking on water clearly exemplify a breach or overruling of the normal observed laws of nature. God's hand was clearly seen in physical, non-subjective events that could not be explained as coincidence or mass hysteria or any other imagined human explanation. The setting, time for a retreat. The setting for the miracle. Since the events of chapter 5, they had traveled back again to Galilee. Jesus was very popular due to the miraculous signs which he was doing. The demands of ministry were very intense. According to Mark 6:31, they didn't even have time to have a meal. John also mentions another Passover, which means that an entire year had passed since the events of the previous chapter. This event took place more than halfway through Jesus' ministry. The 12 apostles had just returned from the mission trip Jesus had sent them on. They wanted to share their experiences. At this time, they also received news of the death of John the Baptist. Jesus took them away for a time of privacy, followed by the crowd. Jesus and his disciples had crossed over the sea by boat, probably from Capernaum to the area around Bethsaida, which is east of the northern tip of the Sea of Galilee. This was a distance of over 3 miles by boat, 4 or 5 miles by land. This would have taken several hours to traverse. The crowd saw them leave in the boat and followed by land. They actually arrived where Jesus was going before he got there. Even though he wanted some private time, when he saw the crowds, he felt compassion for them and began to teach them. It began to get late, and the disciples suggested that Jesus dismiss the multitudes so they could find food and a place to stay. Too late to return home. The crowds had traveled that long distance to be with Jesus. To attempt to make the return trip to reach their homes in Capernaum would be exhausting and definitely too far to go in the dark. The disciples were expecting them to need lodging as well. The temperature could drop to 50 degrees at night in March to April, when Passover was, and a cool breeze from the mountains to the north would feel chilly. The mention of the Passover also may indicate that a good portion of the multitude were pilgrims from other towns in Galilee on their way to Jerusalem. Returning home was out of the question for them. Test to set the stage. Jesus tests Philip with a question. Where are we to buy bread that these may eat? Why Philip? Possibly the question was directed to him because Bethsaida was his hometown. If anyone would know where they could buy bread in that area, it would be Philip. Philip's response was that it would require more bread than they could buy with 200 denarii. A denarius was a day's wage for a common man. This sum would represent over 6 months' wages worth of bread. That's a lot of bread. But even that amount would not be enough for everyone to receive even a little. This gives us an idea of the size of the crowd. How much and how many? In Mark's version, Jesus told the disciples to go find out how much they had to work with. Andrew's mention of the little boy is found only here in John's account. He offered his 5 barley loaves and 2 fishes. Barley was a less desirable grain, and the word for fish indicates they were small, little fish. This was a peasant boy's lunch, just enough for him. John reports that there was much grass in that place. This would have made reclining on the ground much more pleasant. The men were about 5,000 in number. Matthew clarifies that this number did not include the women and children present. The actual gathering of persons could easily have been triple that amount. Details of the miracle. Piecing together the accounts, it appears that Jesus was breaking the bread and fish into baskets, while the disciples carried them out to distribute among the people. Jesus told the disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments." It was customary for Jews to gather up any leftover scraps after a meal. 12 baskets of fragments were a much greater amount than Jesus had in the beginning. If any missed the miracle before, it was obvious now. The matter-of-fact, quiet but unmistakable way in which this sign was performed makes it all the more eloquent in its impact. No sirens, bells, or whistles. The reality of what had happened spoke for itself. The conclusion of the people. When the multitude realized what had taken place, they thought that Jesus was the prophet that Moses had spoken of. Moses had said, "And Yahweh said to me, I will raise up a prophet from among their countrymen like you," from Deuteronomy 18:15 to 19. The Jewish people had been watching for such a prophetic figure to appear. What the people had concluded was that just as Moses had given them bread or manna in the wilderness, so now Jesus had also miraculously fed them bread. In that sense, they identified him as being like Moses. Jesus sent everyone away. Jesus perceived that they were intending to seize him and make him king. Matthew's version inserts that at this point he compelled the disciples to get into the boat and go ahead of him. Their perception of Jesus' true mission was not yet clear, so they would be prone to getting caught up in the mob sentiment. Jesus sent them off by themselves while he dismissed the crowds. Then he withdrew again to the mountain by himself alone. He desired to spend time with the Father in prayer. The disciples were having difficulty. The account of Jesus coming to the disciples at sea by walking on the water is also recorded in Matthew 14:22-27 and Mark 6:45-52. From these three accounts, we find out that the disciples left at Jesus' insistence in the evening. They encountered rough weather and were having difficulty in making progress. The wind often came from the west and could also come rushing down the valley from the north, bringing very strong winds and storms. The transition from afternoon to evening was a common time for such storms. Jesus came on the water. Jesus came near them walking on the water at about the fourth watch of the night, or between 3 to 6 in the morning, and he intended to pass by them, according to Mark 6:48. Note that he did not know what would happen. He thought it would turn out differently than it did. He wanted us to know that about himself. There's no way we would know what his intention was unless he himself reported it. Upon seeing him, the disciples became afraid, thinking he was a ghost. Jesus calmed them, saying, "I am. Do not be afraid." Claim and demonstration. Many translations render Jesus' response as, "It is I." But the Greek words that Jesus used were ego eimi, literally, I am. If their minds had gone back to Job 9:8, they would have been amazed at this prophetic backdrop proclaiming to be the I am. Job described God as the one stretching out the heavens alone and walking upon the waves of the sea. The Greek Septuagint translation was even more clear, walking as upon ground upon the sea. Seeing Jesus walking on the sea and claiming to be I am was unquestionably a claim and demonstration of his deity. Second, I am absolute. This is the second time in the Gospel of John where John records one of these I am statements where there is no predicate. This phenomenon has been referred to as an I am absolute. There are 7 of these scattered throughout the book, and they are part of John's proof to convince us that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, according to 20, verse 30 and 31. They are always in context where there's an incredible claim that Jesus makes, or where there's a miraculous display of power, such as here. The illusion referred to by this phrase is the name of God from Exodus 3:14. Thus, these statements are claims to deity. Peter walked on water too. Matthew records Peter's abortive walk on the water also in Matthew 14:18-21. This should be a reminder that a sign in itself should not be enough to convince us that Jesus is God. The power that sustained Peter on the water until he became afraid was the same power that had sustained Jesus. It was a work which the Father gave him to do. Such signs were performed by other people of God, including prophets, the apostles, and other believers. Even the multiplication of food had been done before. Furthermore, the enemy can also sometimes produce miraculous signs to deceive people. Signs point to the presence of supernatural power. Peter was the only one of the 12 who was willing to ask Jesus to call him out of the boat, and took the risk of stepping out. Geographical transportation. Here, after they let Jesus into the boat, immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. Another display of power, as if walking on the water was not enough. Again, this is not the only example of this kind of translation or teleportation to another location. The Holy Spirit will later transport Philip from the desert road to Gaza, where he administered to the Ethiopian eunuch, to a location some 20 miles away. One moment he was there baptizing the eunuch, and the next moment he found himself at Azotus. Acts 8:40. Teleportation in itself may indicate the hand of God or some other supernatural power, but it does not mean that the person is God. Faulty interpretations of miracles. There are two errant interpretations of miracles. The first is to think that Jesus did miracles because he was God, and we are not, so we should not expect miracles to take place anymore. Of course, this ignores the language used about Jesus' dependence upon the Father and the teachings about the nature of the incarnation, as well as the glaring contradiction of the many miracles performed by a variety of people throughout biblical and church history. In John 14:12, Jesus tells us that the ones believing in him can expect to do the kinds of works he did by the indwelling power of God. Miracles may not be from God. The second error is to think that any miraculous sign is necessarily a sign of God's presence or his blessing. The scriptures are quite clear that there are false signs and wonders that are not of God, but look very much like the genuine miracles which God has done. In these cases, the Bible instructs us that we are to examine the other fruit of the lives of those who perform signs, that is, their personal character, theology, and the influence they have on others. Why is this miracle so significant? This is the only miracle that Jesus performed that's found recorded in all four Gospels. There's also an additional parallel episode, the feeding of the 4,000 men, plus women and children, which is also recorded by Matthew and Mark. Why do you suppose that these particular accounts of the multiplication of loaves and fishes would be included in all four Gospels? What is the significance of this? I think that there are two major lessons to be learned from these incidents. One, God is our provider. First, God is able to meet all of our needs. That's not to say that we may not experience hardship or hunger. The apostles all experienced the reality of both of these difficulties, according to 1 Corinthians 4:9-13. The message is, however, that God is able to provide. Coming to grips with the ability of God to provide was essential for these men to leave their businesses to follow Jesus, as well as for us who are seeking to follow Christ. Can we trust that God can and will provide for us if we choose to give more to him? Jesus underlined this lesson. Jesus made this even more explicit when, shortly after feeding the 4,000, he was confronted by Pharisees and Sadducees demanding a sign from heaven. After refusing their demands, he said to his disciples in their boat, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." They misunderstood his statement as referring to the fact that they had taken no bread along. Jesus reminded them how much was left over after the 2 episodes of multiplying food. Then he asked, "How is it that you do not understand that I did not speak to you concerning bread?" Bread was not the issue. They had seen how God could provide. He had spoken figuratively about the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees, not at all about literal bread. Number 2, we should work for what is eternal. The second lesson comes from John 6:27. Do not labor for the food which perishes, but for that which endures to eternal life. Our natural point of view is to focus on our everyday needs as our first and primary concern. The multiplication of the loaves and fish demonstrated there is a spiritual reality which is deeper and more significant than these temporal concerns alone. We should be working for what is eternal. Priority living. In Matthew 6, Jesus teaches his disciples not to be anxious about their daily needs. Those who do not know God eagerly seek these necessities, but for us, the priority should be to seek God's kingdom, his reign and rule in our lives. If we do that, he will take care of our needs. There's more to our existence than to grow up, make a living, or raise a family, or be successful at business. We are here to serve God. Instead of temporal concerns, we should invest in things that will endure, fruit that will remain.